welcome. Morena, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for joining our session this morning. Really excited to have you all here. My name's Austin. I'm a product manager at Toitū Envirocare, and I'm going to be your host for today's panel discussion. This morning we have an hour. We're going to be diving into the second emissions reduction plan with our panel this morning. We do have some pre-arranged questions, which we'll begin with in just a moment, but there's also going to be a live Q&A session. You can ask the panel your questions. Please use the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. And you also, in the Q&A, feel free to upvote for other questions that you'd also like to see answered. We're going to do our best to answer as many of these as we can within the hour. The session is being recorded. We'll send it to everyone in the coming days. If there are questions we don't get to, we'll report back with some answers to those after the event. I'm going to start now by introducing each of our speakers today. It's a really great group. So I'll start with Belinda, Dr. Belinda Mathers. She's the Chief Science and Advisory Officer at Toitū Envirocare. Belinda leads our science and advisory function. She's ensuring that we keep on top of scientific research, changes in best practice, changing market needs. Belinda has extensive experience in greenhouse gas emissions management, verification across many sectors, including verifying or certifying close to 1,000 emission inventories over the last 20 years. Dr. Sean Weaver. Sean is the founder and CEO of Ekos, a social purpose business delivering carbon management services and nature-based solutions. He's an international expert in market-based mechanisms for environmental and climate financing. He's a consultant to national and local governments, multilateral banks, international agencies, small, medium, and large businesses and corporations. Sean's a founding member of the Climate Forestry Association, a member of the New Zealand Institute of Forestry, and a founding member of the International Biodiversity Credits Alliance. He's a registered forestry consultant, has a PhD in forestry from the University of Canterbury, and is based in Christchurch. Mike Burrell. Mike is Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council, SBC, and the Climate Leaders Coalition, CLC. SBC is a CEO-led membership organization with over 120 businesses ambitious for a sustainable New Zealand. Collectively, those members represent more than 34% of New Zealand's gross domestic product. CLC compromises over 100 signatories, accounting for almost 60% of New Zealand's emissions. And that group is focused on building irreversible momentum towards a zero carbon future. Mike's previous role was with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where he was Director of Sustainable Economic Development before serving as New Zealand's High Commissioner to South Africa. And we also have Jeff Smit. Jeff is a director and GM at DETA, who are leading the decarbonization of New Zealand industry. Jeff consults to a wide range of industrial and commercial business on their carbon reduction goals, and also supports engagements to provide technical support to government policy. Aside from his DETA role, Jeff leads an electric transport startup, eStroke, deploying cost-effective electric marine craft with a circular lens. Jeff has 3 young children and is driven to use his skills to give them the best future possible. So, really excellent group of minds this morning. I think we're going to have a really amazing conversation. In order to set the scene for the conversation, I am going to just really quickly cover and remind you guys what the emissions reduction plan is and how it impacts New Zealand's climate strategy. Please feel free to start throwing any questions into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be getting to those in just a moment. So the emissions reduction plan, it shapes New Zealand's efforts to meet a domestic climate change targets. It steers us towards net zero by 2050. This plan really plays a crucial role in our overarching strategy. It helps define the actions, the policies needed to stay within our emission budgets for the upcoming 5-year period. The emission budgets set legally binding caps on greenhouse gas production for a 5-year period. These budgets, you can think about them as sort of stepping stones, guiding us progressively toward our long-term climate goals. The first emissions budget covered the years 2020 to 2025, and that really established a foundation. And now the second emissions reduction plan, which the draft is open for consultation right now, this next one's going to outline the budget and necessary actions for the next 5 years, so 26 to 30. In the second ERP, it's going to be published by the end of this year. And currently in this consultation phase. The consultation at the moment is open until the 21st of August. And this is a really vital opportunity for stakeholders and the public, for businesses, for everyone to contribute feedback. The draft really openly asks for, what do you think we should do? What do you want us to do? What is our role here? There's 63 questions available for input if you're keen on those things, but you don't actually have to address them all. You can focus on just the top 5 summary questions in the general consultation section if that's more convenient. The key here is to make sure that your voice is heard and that we get this working the way that New Zealand individuals, families, communities, and businesses really want it to. So we are going to open up the panel discussion now. Please make use of that Q&A box at the bottom. Feel free to upvote other questions as you see them coming in. But we're going to get started with some that we had submitted in advance and that we've pre-prepared. So I'm going to throw this to everyone in the panel. Just a quick answer for everyone. We'll just go ahead and start with Sean because you're first on my screen. What is your initial take on the inclusions within the ERP2? Did anything positively surprise you?
I wasn't necessarily positively surprised by anything because there's a lot of things that are not really that different. The government did talk about shifting the design of the ETS potentially, and I think that would be a very good thing if we were to do that, and I can share some thoughts about that in a wee while. And yeah, I think that's the main thing that I thought was a good thing that was stated, because it gives us potentially room to sharpen and refine and tune the design of a core instrument for reducing emissions going forward. Thanks.
Nice. Jeff?
Look, I like the fact that we still have some actual carbon reduction targets within the plan. I guess there was a little concern on our side that the government wasn't going to take this seriously and not push that hard. So we're still looking, I guess, in that 2031 to 2035 window to make some reductions. What concerns me is where those reductions are likely going to come from. The vast majority are going to come at this point from CCUS, which is a relatively unproven technology, as well as agricultural emissions, again, based on science that isn't necessarily here or being rolled out at the scale that we need right now. So positive, there are targets. I'm not sure where they're realistically going to come from.
Okay. All right. Belinda, how about you?
Yeah, similar to Jeff, I think that, yeah, good to see that there's some stuff in there. Good to see that there's a real request for ideas. So I think the government truly is seeking and needs our ideas for policy, for, you know, what can government do? But yeah, I guess I'm concerned about the extent to which it's relying on things that aren't necessarily proven in the New Zealand context, which should be part of the mix, but not necessarily, you know, core to the mix.
Yeah. All right. And Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I suppose similar. First of all, I think the openness of the government to hear from and work with business on solutions in shaping the final ERP, that's really to be applauded, and I think it does present an opportunity. But it's going to be challenging for us to do that given the current settings, because there's quite a number of things in there that we would have expected to see around policy settings that we've seen with our international trading partners and that we ourselves had, that would give us that short, medium and long-term certainty that's required for the ultimately billions of dollars of private capital that are going to need to flow in to make this change. And so, I mean, our big message is, you know, doing a classic New Zealand, which is flip-flopping on policy all the time, is really unhelpful. So getting some policy stability, particularly on the big planks, is really critical. And so I suppose what we're saying is drop it down a level from the architecture. Great to see multi-party support on that. Now let's take that down a level and look at those big planks. Don't sweat the small stuff, but those bigger levers that we're going to require, that we'll need to have in place to see that investment flow need to be there. And we're not seeing that currently.
Yeah. Let's explore this a little bit further. So one of the questions from the audience, and please keep those coming, from Shami, what do you see as the key responsibilities of government versus business versus individuals in driving emission reduction. To help inform your answers, I'm actually going to share the results from the panel we opened up with, where we asked our audience where they think the top 3 roles of government in emissions reduction are. So I'm going to share those for you guys. But I think it's an interesting question looking at the role of government here, which, who's preparing this plan, but also businesses and individuals. How do you see these things playing out? Let's see here. Anyone want to jump in first? Strong opinions?
First, if you like. So I guess I've just had the poll list come up, and I immediately jumped to providing some certainty. Look, I think at the moment we're kind of living in a fairly uncertain world in the energy space, and that's a space that I know relatively well. And I think in some ways we're at the circumstance that we find ourselves in around the energy space is due to that uncertainty that Mike alluded to earlier on, where we have governments flip-flopping between trying to make the right decision, not having that followed through, and then we end up in a position where we've kind of exposed ourselves. And I fear that, we are currently living that world in the energy sector, and will continue to live that for some time. But I guess what I see here is there's nothing really linking that that opportunity and still taking that seriously. We still aren't really providing any level of certainty for industry or for New Zealand as a whole with this plan, which I guess concerns me.
I would agree with that, and just add that the uncertainty in this market is preventing some of the most powerful forces in the economy, which is the institutional investor community, from divesting from dirty development and investing in clean development. Globally, the taxpayer can't afford to solve the climate change problem, neither can philanthropy. It has to come from private money. In order to move that private money, that money is available to move. And a survey that was done by the UN Foundation, even back as far as 2008, asked the institutional investor community globally, what is stopping you from investing in clean technology, clean development? And they said it's the investment risk profile around these new technologies, new innovations, new development formats, and that the thing that would enable them to move their money at monstrous scales is if governments of the world decided that they were going to play this role of de-risking those investments, so that money could crowd into that space and we could have a sea change in the entire movement of the economy. And we're just not seeing that. In order to get that, we have to have much more policy stability. We've got to have cross-party agreements. We've got to stop this being a football and see climate change as an issue somewhat like superannuation and defence. It has to be cross-party, long-term. The goalposts have to be deep, and they've got to stay in the same place.
Can I just build on what Sean's just said, because I 100% agree with everything except for one piece. I absolutely agree with certainty. I absolutely agree with, I would agree with the providing policy certainty is number 1, actually. And I think removing regulatory and other barriers is number 2, because those are the roles of government, right? I don't think it needs to incentivize anymore. I think what's changed since 2008 is that the amount of money available for this is so enormous that the de-risking is no longer required. In fact, this capital is looking for a home, but it's looking for a safe home. And currently, New Zealand's not a safe home. We're seen as flip-floppers, we're seen as shilly-shalliers. We need to just harden up here, and just go, actually, to Sean's point, this is a medium-term to long-term game. It's a 25 to 50-year game. We can't be, I was going to use some bad language there. We can't be faffing about with our policy settings all the time. It doesn't, we learned that with superannuation the hard way, which is that we mucked around for 15, 20 years. And what happened? The Australians and the Canadians and others now own large amounts of New Zealand business. Why? They did it off the back of these big long-term investments that they did. What did we do? We faffed about. Couldn't get any sort of stability on it. We finally got some stability. And what happens? We start growing the pie. No different here. This is an investment game now. The government will never have sufficient funding to be able to do the job. It's really going to come down to private capital, both domestic and, more importantly, international capital. It will flow once we stop faffing about. And we need that firmament there, right? The second thing I'd say is the focus on incentives is actually to our detriment. Because by getting into that game, then we get into the classic left, right, back and forward game. Let's just get away from that. We don't need them anymore. We're grown-ups. What we need is the policy certainty, and it needs to be a long game.
Belinda, would you add anything there? I think maybe potentially leaning into the role of business versus government.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in the context of the question, because the question was about individual versus business versus government. I think the government side of it's been really well covered by the other panelists, and I think it's the responsibility of everybody, whether it be individuals, business or governments, to make the decisions that are within our power to make for the good of the climate and the wider environment and our society and all those things. But those decisions are different decisions, whether you be an individual who is deciding about, am I going to buy this product or this product? Am I going to do this thing or am I going to not? Businesses are thinking about, what are the products that we're making and how are we making them? What are the services we're offering? Those sorts of things. And how can we do that in a more emissions efficient way? And the government is providing the enabling environment for all that to happen. So I guess that's my high level view on those different roles, but it all comes down to making good decisions in whatever context you're in.
Let's lean into that a little bit. The next question from the audience from Irene: does the panel think a sector-based approach is still the most appropriate? It seems to miss opportunities for cross-sector initiatives. So thinking about that context and the role that we're all playing. Jeff, do you want to get started on that one?
Yeah, I agree that it does. I think, and again, one of the pieces I'll mention in the plan in the top, I guess, 7 list. The seventh one there is around organic waste management, and there's a lovely connection there between organic waste and gas production, which is talked about but isn't really alluded to in terms of the impact that it could have on the energy sector at the same time. I think there are a number of examples like that we could be doing better, but I guess, again, from the perspective of an industrial and perhaps an energy person, I think there is a role to be played here around finding the best home for those fuels, and at the moment around making sure that we're using things like biomass or electricity or gas in the right locations at the right time. Letting the market drive some of that and letting end users drive some of that, I guess, ends up with potentially emotional outcomes and doesn't end up with the best outcome for New Zealand as a whole. But yeah, I think we can do far better. And one example is actually the plan already, which is relatively positive, but isn't as opaque as it could be.
Possibly Mike or Sean.
I could add to that. A good
do.
example of a cross-sectoral synergy, which is absent from our national emissions reduction strategy, is linking strong mitigation action with climate change resilience and adaptation. Now, a classic example, we've got the east coast of the North Island on a hiding to nothing when it comes to each cyclone that comes in and wrecks those local economies. We've got hillsides that need permanent forest on them. We've got an NZETS where all of the supply side comes from the forest sector, but that forest sector is not being directed to those landscapes. So a great example of a potential synergy is to direct the supply side of NZUs to those landscapes that need them most, rather than spreading it around the country to increase the profitability of the forest industry, which that has its benefits, but we're losing this opportunity to solve 2 problems with 1 instrument.
Anyone else? Cross-sectoral versus sectoral approach?
Yeah, let's not get all binary on this. It's both, right? It's both. It's this. So I think sectoral is still necessary. There's a lot of work to do within those specific sectors, but I can't think of a single sector that's not going to require cross-sectoral as well. Sean's one is a fantastic example. Wish I thought of it. There's another one that I think is important here, which is something as simple as charging infrastructure. If you just look at charging infrastructure narrowly through a transport lens, then you're going to miss all of the energy linkages. And you're going to miss a whole lot of other linkages as well, including how you make sure that the system is resilient. So, it's cross-sectoral all the way, but not to the point where you can't get anything done. Truthfully, New Zealand's economy and its politics is set up in sectors. So, that's partly how the solution will work. But yeah, those linkages are going to be really critical.
Yeah, and even thinking about, charging networks, there's so many other opportunities, right? Creating these little community hubs where, going on a road trip, right? And how do we help bring back some of those rural communities that we don't have with rail anymore, something like that. We're going to shift to the next question, very popular one submitted from our audience today. Should the ERP be removed from government control in a similar way to the central bank control of interest rates? Interesting one here. Anyone want to dive in?
It's one of those things that sounds like a really obvious solution. The truth is that the discussion around central banking took close to 120 years to land where it did. Because governments don't like giving up control, and they certainly don't like, binding a hand behind their back. In this case, too. I don't think we're quite there yet, because I actually don't think that we've got the momentum necessary that you have in the finance sector to enable for that kind of hands-off approach. I'm hoping that we will be there in the upcoming years, but at this stage, there is still an active role for government, as we've just been discussing. And I think there is a danger that if you go down this route, government will go, job done. Job done. And the job's not done. Clearly it's not done. As I always say, the market will clear. There just might not be as many humans around, right? So do you want to wait for the market to clear? Or do actually you want to take a mixed economy approach, which frankly is the approach that the entire globe has taken since World War II. So let's not get too purist. We're a very mixed economy. And so, I don't think we're quite there yet. I would love for us to be there, but I feel like we're probably a decade or two away yet.
Consensus? Anyone challenge? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just think it's important that, we're in a democracy, and in a democracy, if what you do is unpopular, you tend to lose the election. And if we want to win the election, you need to help people, and you need to do things that are not siloed. You need to do things that are going to grow the opportunities for communities, and for those communities to feel that they can trust that government. And then if you do that, then whoever's going to be in the contest for government is going to continue to do those things, because the country says this is what we need. And at the moment, we're not yet at a place where the nation is united around a common threat to all of us. We're divided, and those divisions have been driven by interest groups that have muddied the waters around what otherwise could be a nation building opportunity across urban, rural, and across many sectors. Classic example is the sort of the amount of effort that's been put in by agriculture to stay out of the emissions trading scheme and to not have an emissions liability, and to sort of be given or demanding a free ride in this process. Now, there's many things that agriculture needs to support its transition to a low carbon form, but that'll happen better if the whole country's behind agriculture, and the nation sees agriculture as which it is, as a major export earner. That's something for all of us to be proud of. But at the moment, the divisiveness is preventing that. And I think political leadership is not stepping in as much as it needs to resolve those major conflicts.
I agree, but I'd also say that we're kind of coming to the point now where some of these decisions we're making are hard, and they have impact on individuals. And when you talk about the politics getting in the way, in some ways that's why it's a weaker document, because if it was a document reflecting what we have to really do in terms of, I guess, all of those sectors, then that wouldn't be a particularly attractive document for many voters to vote for. And so I guess at the moment, both, I guess you might talked about the need to keep that within government. I think that is restricting our ability to do things more quickly. The general populace, and again, we saw that with, say, the clean car discount, where the general populace got a little bit frustrated with the fact that everyone can have a discounted EV, but you're taxing the ute, because it's starting to impact individuals. These hard decisions we're having to make, and we'll have to get the decisions will get harder and harder and more impactful over the coming decade. I think, the structure means it's going to be limiting in terms of how we can actually approach this.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jeff, but I also agree with what Sean said, which is that you can't depoliticize this. Well, you can, but then you become an autocracy, right? The democratic process means that we are getting into the difficult stuff. And remember, we've already made a set of decisions by not making decisions. Decision through indecision has been New Zealand's hallmark for close to 50 years. And on this subject for 35 years. I spent quite a bit of my career defending the indefensible, which was basically making up stories about how New Zealand was meeting its targets and clearly wasn't. We are very, very good at can kicking. We are very good at free riding. Unfortunately, we are now out of tune and out of sync with our major trading partners who are looking at us and thinking, why are these little buggers free riding? You know, actually, and they may well punish us for it. They might just say, actually, you know what? We will let the French farmers have their way, and we will use this as a non-tariff trade barrier because you guys are being unreasonable. We're not asking you to lead. We're just asking you to be part of the pack. If you don't follow the pack, then just like if anybody's been watching any of the races recently, you will get left behind, right? So we have to be in the pack, or it's going to really impact us in a trade sense. But the other thing I would say is that that sort of turning this into a binary around government versus business is not helpful. We know that it's the partnership that's going to be critical. We're a small outfit, right? We're tiny. You know, we're basically a medium-sized city. In fact, I ranked us once. I think we're not even in the top 300 cities, for goodness sake. You know, so we are minuscule. And so we just got to get over ourselves and start leveraging our advantage. Our advantage is our smallness, and that means we can be nimble, and that means we can actually act in a collective way and get some stuff done. And we've shown it many, many times. We were blooming brilliant during the early part of COVID, for example. Turned on a dime, just got on with it. You know, New Zealand pragmatism came in. When we're not so good is when we're not pragmatic, when we get all ideological on it. And I always say New Zealanders don't like ideology. They see government as a fridge. It's just an appliance. They just want it to do its thing quietly over in the corner and make sure that their food is kept, you know, fresh. When it starts getting all ideological and people go into their corners, it's really unhelpful. By the way, people lose elections. So it's the centre is where government is fought. And I think you know, we need to be working with all governments of all strips to say this is a major issue. Think it's a problem now, guys? Wait 20 years. You want to see what a real problem looks like? You just wait. And so if we're going to have any sort of voice internationally, we have to be part of the pack. And currently, we're not.
Just to wrap that up, because I know we need to get on to the next question. So just a slight tangential comment. I think part of our problem here is an information problem. I think it's a global problem and a national problem, and you know, it's a problem all over the place between the availability of good, evidence-based, real, trustable information that people can make both political and business decisions on. And in some ways, if we've got the right information based on science, it makes decision making easier across the board, wherever this sits.
I think let's dive into some of the more details. We spent a lot of time talking about the kind of role of government, the role of business, and looking at this more broadly, but let's dive into some of the specifics within here. So we've got a really good question here. The Climate Change Commission advice to government for the ERP2 was to be cautious about net reductions versus gross reductions. So I'm going to throw to the panelists. Maybe we'll start with Sean. Can you talk to the ERP2 increase on relying on forestry planting, so biogenic carbon, versus fossil carbon reductions?
Yeah, we've got a false dichotomy with gross versus net. It's gross and net. We need net. In fact, net zero isn't enough to solve the global climate problem. We need to have some, we actually need we need to be deeply carbon negative for quite a few, probably centuries actually. And so to have the view that somehow forests are cheating is just a nonsense, right? So we absolutely have to have net, because gross zero is impossible. Like, it's not only fossil fuel reductions that we've got to reduce, it's biogenic carbon. And last time I checked, I'm not a plant, so I actually emit CO2 all day, every day. And no matter, even if we got rid of all fossil fuels, we're still producing CO2 emissions from agriculture. As long as we want to live and eat, we're going to be emitting. So it's always going to be a balance in the total system. And in that system, it's a wee bit like financial accounting. You've got your revenue and your costs. And if one is equal to the other, you've got a net position. You've also got to be smart as a business and not just increase your revenue. You've got to reduce your costs. And this is what we need to do with emissions. We've got to reduce our costs, our emissions, as much as possible, and do that in a smart way so that we get to a point where we've got an energy efficient, robust economy that can compete in international markets and be not left behind. The role of forests is always going to be there. It's really a question about how we want to manage those forests and how we want to direct it geographically. And I said before, let's go fix Tairāwhiti and Hawke's Bay as a priority. in the way that we target the use of the forest part of the equation.
Jeff, do you maybe want to throw a bit of an energy spin on this?
I mean, I agree with what Sean's saying, but yeah, the reality is you do have to do both at the same time, and I think we know that. You can't plunge your way out of this into and Sean certainly doesn't expect that either. We do have to do both quite quickly. I think in some ways, and I talked about what's easy earlier on, there is a perception that planting trees is easy and sort of takes the problem further away, and reducing emissions is quite complicated and hard. And I think, again, Belinda, you made the point earlier on around kind of a marketing and messaging lens. I think that's part of the lens we have to sort of explain is actually by reducing our emissions, we can be more efficient, reducing our costs. And then, yeah, a lot of the work that we do is around telling that story to go from point one where we are today, drive costs down, and then switch a fuel. And look, the messaging just has to be clearer that yes, that's what we have to do, but actually it makes business sense to do that. More businesses are getting online, but it just is, shall we say, taking time.
Right. We've got a question about the ETS from the audience. So the question says, to reduce investor uncertainty and the government flip-flopping on policy settings that we mentioned, do you see any value in changing the ETS from a market-based mechanism to a more simple carbon tax with price path specified by the Climate Change Commission? Ultimately, the private sector is not decarbonizing at a great rate because both carbon price is low and electricity price is high. And in the question, do you argue long-term? So I think we can speak a little bit more broadly about the ETS as well, but thinking about value, the specific question, do you think value in changing the ETS from a market-based mechanism to a more simple carbon tax with a price path specified by the Commission?
Can I come in on that one, Austin?
Yeah, go for it.
We spent close to 15 years debating this topic in New Zealand, and it damn near tore us apart. It certainly led to the demise of the New Zealand Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I wouldn't want to see us opening that up again. We landed on an instrument, it's massively imperfect. They all are imperfect, by the way, including carbon tax. It seems very simple until you start to unpack it. We'll see how the Danes get on. But we've never had a well-functioning ETS. We've forgotten what it's there for. It's there to incentivize investment in low carbon and zero carbon emissions options. And the way to do that is to make sure that the price goes up so that it becomes more attractive to do other things. Unfortunately, because we have a little mini economic crisis about once every 6 years globally, here in New Zealand it's the same. That means that once every sort of 5 years or so, we panic because we've got to get through a recession. Yeah? And when we do that, suddenly we want to cap the price, not in a good way, not cap the carbon, but cap the price. And so it doesn't do its job. And when people start talking about a stable carbon price, I have to remind them that that's not the point. The point is that you do want it to go up because you want to change behavior. At the moment, it's not doing that, and it's not doing it for a whole variety of reasons that we're all very aware of. But the biggest reason for it, if we look at the ETS, is that we have got this massive number of surplus credits that we haven't really got a plan for, and we don't have a hard cap on emissions. Because the production of units through forestry, unlike almost any other system in the world, is included within our system. That means that it's not functioning. So like I think it was Sean said earlier on, I really welcome the fact that the government seems to be open to a discussion on the ETS because it's not doing its job. And if they're going to lean heavily on it, it needs to do its job.
Sean, go for it.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Mike on this. We've got an instrument, and one option is to smash it, the other option is to tune it, and I prefer to tune the instrument. It already functions essentially as a tax and drag anyway, because it's just a tax that's collected by private sector upstream entities in the energy sector, broadly speaking, and flows a price of carbon through the economy. One thing it doesn't do is expose institutional investors that much to a carbon price, because those upstream entities in the energy sector can just raise their energy prices so that it functions like a tax. And so they're not really exposed to that carbon price. There's no actual price sensitivity that would drive their behaviour to change at that institutional level. As a result, the institutional investors that support those sectors are also relatively insulated from the impact of the carbon price. Now, this to me is the biggest design flaw in the ETS, and why we need a cap and trade system, not just a trade system, and where participant-specific caps are imposed upon all of the big emitters that are obligated by law to participate in the ETS, and then they're not insulated from the impact of the carbon price, and then that will change and that will drive investment decisions, investment behaviour towards low carbon. In addition to that, every organisation and every country has low-hanging fruit in the emission reduction system, and they have medium fruit and they have high fruit. The high fruit are either impossible to harvest, or they're prohibitively expensive. And so we focus on the low and medium fruit. And if we have a government instrument that's designed to harvest those fruit with a carbon price that's sufficient, and where people are exposed to that price who make the big decisions, then we will transition much more rapidly to a low carbon economy that we seek.
100%.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, guys. We've got quite a few more questions coming in, so I'm going to move us just along rapidly. Another question from the audience, just something that we were thinking about as a panel earlier as well, is so thinking about the need to account for our offsets in 2030 on our government books to show the liability if we don't invest in reduction. So thinking about that, sort of the financial liabilities of the net as well as the gross equation.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing that sorry, I won't take long, Jeff. But it's an interesting kind of part of that least cost consideration that is talked about in the emissions reduction plan. Least cost needs to be long-term whole economy cost. So we need to be thinking about all elements of cost, including that what happens if we don't meet our targets, what's that going to cost us, both financially and in other ways. So hand over to Jeff to add a bit more.
Really quickly, look, I agree with you, Belinda, but I think the bit we're missing beyond the fact that we're going to have to potentially buy offshore credits is actually our inability to access markets in the future and what that could look like. I noticed there was a question earlier on indicating that we're a country that feeds 40 million people around the world, and we are, and that's a large portion of where our income will, I guess, comes from today and probably will come in the future. But the world is asking for lower carbon products. Being at the bottom of the world makes things very hard for us to get to market. And over time, we will be losing opportunities to access those higher value markets because of our inaction in this space. So I think, yes, let's consider the cost of enacting to buy those offshore credits so we can remain in the, I guess, an international player in the space. But then also by not acting, how much are we going to close ourselves off, and our product's going to be worth X% less by not doing this?
Yeah, this is a technical question. So the Treasury has taken advice on this, I think, at least 5 or 6 times over the last couple of decades. And the advice it's received is that currently it is not under any obligation, and in fact would be wise not to see this as a contingent liability because it's poorly defined. And so that's the technical reason that they're not doing this. That is rapidly changing as we go from forecasts to actuals on climate change. So, 20 years ago, you could say, well, this is all theoretical. You can't say that now. We have a set of very defined, the data on this is, is very clear. And so I think the time is coming where just purely from a fiduciary duty point of view, and from an accounting perspective, they will need to account for it. I don't think that's too many years away, and I'm sure that it's something that our good friends in the Treasury are onto and are thinking about, or if they're not, then they need to be, because it's going to happen quite quickly, and it will happen right across the board. There'll be many OECD countries that are caught up in this where they will just have to account for it. And I would counsel getting prepared for that day, because when it happens, it will be sudden, and it will be of huge import to New Zealand, because suddenly our debt position and the debt position of our trading partners will look much more severe.
I 100% agree. And also, if it's a predictable contingent liability, any organisation that has a predictable contingent liability that's only a few years down the track, if you don't account for it now, you can't plan for it. And if you can't plan for it, then you won't actually plan yourself out of that hole. If you do put it on your books now, it sends a very strong signal, not only to the market, but also to the voting public to say, goodness, we've got this big liability to the taxpayer at Paris, at the true up for Paris. And why don't we try massively reduce our contingent liability by investing in a stitch in time saves 9 activities now? So I think one of the strategic benefits of doing that now is to provide a stronger momentum for the kind of deep emission reductions investments that we need early on. It also increases the chances of a cross-party agreement, because if the nation recognises that whoever's going to get the reins in 2032 and 2031 and the true-up period, they're going to have to deal with this. So that's a way to have an agreement across different parties.
Sean, can I just build on that last point? I think that's a really important point. We know that there is a fiscal cliff coming. We know there is, if for no other reason that we're going to have to do massive climate adaptation in New Zealand, and we're a coastal economy that is extremely exposed to changing climate. We know this is coming. We also know that the liability of us not meeting our Paris Agreement is also significant. So it's a double cliff. We know it's coming. The question is who wants to deal with that cliff? Yeah, and of course, everyone wants to sort of shove halfpenny here, right? They want it to be, it's a little bit like musical chairs. They don't want to be in the chair to do the big kid stuff, to actually make a call on this, because it's ugly. It reminds me very much of superannuation. No one wants to deal with the realities of superannuation, be the bad kid who has to say, guess what? You've got to work for another 2 years because we can't afford to pay you. No one wants to be the big kid to do that. And so people keep shoving that halfpenny and pushing it onto somebody else. Well, at some stage, someone has to put the big kid trousers on and actually make the call. Now, I'm hoping that it's this government, because if it ain't, then it's just going to be even more and harder and harder. And ultimately, the decision will be made for us rather than by us.
Right. Got the next question. I'm going to go to one that was submitted in advance from the attendees. So there were a few emissions in the ERP, fossil fuels, building emissions. What do you think this means, and what impact does this have, not having it be comprehensive?
Yeah, I was really surprised not to see building emissions in there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of emissions locked in for a long time when we build new buildings. So, actually, it would be really helpful to have some focus on, reduce construction waste, lower emissions building materials, more efficient buildings being built in New Zealand, making sure they do have the insulation, the technology built in, all those sorts of things that are going to, over the 50 to 100 year lifetime of the building, make sure that they are as emissions efficient as they possibly can be. So I was surprised about that, and I would really encourage people to submit to, that there's more than the 2 sentences that are in the current consultation document in that building space.
Yeah, definitely keep in mind everyone can submit on this, and so please comment both on what's in there but also what's not in there. Let's see here. There's a question. I think we've talked a little bit about the government already, so probably just a real quick answer. The panel, what do you see the role of local versus central government?
Very tricky. Local government has to implement a whole lot of things that central government want to happen, or they need to steer it in a local context. The work that we do with local government is showing us that many local government entities, especially rural ones, don't have the capacity, they don't have the rate space to have enough staff to get their head around this sort of thing. And they end up relying on bigger councils to kind of do their thinking for them. And then it's not always, tuned to the local council's needs in terms of looking at planning for land use change and things like that. So, local councils need a lot more support, I believe, so that they can make prudent decisions that are not just knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah, I again, there's a binary thing here that really just drives me crazy around centralisation versus decentralisation. All of history shows us it's a functional relationship between central and local. That's always what you're looking for.
Nice.
A good definition, and you want there to be a creative tension between the two. Yeah, and in New Zealand at the moment, I think we see some of that. There are some really good examples of that. Unfortunately, we don't see enough examples, and so I think that this is where that partnership between central government and local government becomes critical, because to Sean's point, the climate is very inconvenient. The impacts don't generally fall where the folk are. And so it has this massive impact on people that just don't have the rating base to be able to pay for the challenges. And so this is where the central government and local government are going to have to work together, or else New Zealand is going to look very, very different from where it is today. There are going to be whole areas that are basically we're just going to have to walk away from. There are areas, for example, in Southern Africa where the tsetse fly has had such an impact that entire communities have had to just walk away from their towns and villages. And you can go to those places now and they are really quite creepy, right? Because there are no humans there anymore. We are going to see a similar thing here in New Zealand. There are going to be places that we will go and visit and go, oh, it's amazing to think people used to live here. Sadly, some of those places will be cities. So we better be starting to think about how we're actually going to protect those cities and how that flow of capital is going to move to those places. And that's going to take a really strong partnership between central government and local government.
Nice. All right. A question that's been getting a few votes from other attendees here. Is there a risk that the 2024 energy crisis will derail longer-term emission policies? Or is it important that this does lead the focus of ERP2? Maybe Jeff, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think it goes back to, you asked the question earlier on around why fossil fuels aren't really noted in here. So I guess by default, we're talking about them now because of the challenging situation that we find ourselves in. Look, I found it interesting listening to the radio this morning. The government's starting to talk about importing fuels. And not to make this political, but I just think it's interesting reflecting where thinking about connected up and tied in policy. As a country, we chose in 2018, the previous government chose to stop offshore exploration, which is where some of this uncertainty came from. That was followed up with Giddy, and Giddy was supposed to then go and help to reduce gas demand over a period of time to allow us some certainty. Now, I guess we can argue whether or not Giddy would have had the outcome we'd like, given its focus has been heavily on coal rather than gas. But to a certain degree, we've ended up in this position because of a lack of connected up thinking, which has pretty much been the topic of our conversation today. Do I think it's going to cause a slowdown? No, I actually don't. I think it's going to create momentum for people to get certainty longer term. If I think about the opportunities that, say, industry has in front of them right now, sure, energy prices are horrifically high and we're seeing businesses that are pausing or currently going to be shutting down. But it's impossible to get a gas contract moving forward. It is possible to get long-term electricity contracts, which can give some certainty over a longer period of time. And so I think there will be a certainty play here for business to move towards electrification more quickly. Nothing to do with decarbonisation. I think it's about access to fuel. But there will be, because we're having to react now, there are going to be businesses that end up suffering in the short term, and the short term will be 2 to 3 years as we kind of move through this.
Yeah. Just conscious of time, the next question, we're going to come back to some of the detail in the ERP. So Dave has asked, in paragraph 4 of the ERP introduction, Minister Watts states that climate change is an economy issue. This statement seems very myopic in isolation. Do you think that the government or Minister Watts views climate change through a systemic lens?
It's an economy issue, but not only an economy issue, right? We've caused the problem. It's, important that we do the right things to solve the problem, and through our economy is one way to do that. But it is clearly an issue that goes much broader than just economic. So I think Sean's ready to.
Yeah, I mean, I know Jeff's probably wanting to talk to, and Mike maybe, but yeah, it depends on how you understand the economy. I see the economy as just kind of the human ecosystem in a way. It's an ecological, it's a systems view. So I'm glad that it's seen as a systems view. And And the economy and nature are not separate. That's a kind of the key thing. And also the economy and people are not separate. So broadening, I mean, I agree with Belinda, broadening it out, but perhaps defining what one means by the economy would be a useful thing to do. You know, if it's the sum total of interactions between people, which is where the original word economy comes from, the Greek word oikos, by the way, which is where ekos comes from as a word, but it's also the common ancestor of the word ecology. So they both come from the same common ancestor, and the notion is the house and the home and all of the interactions that happen. So all of that interconnectedness is economy, but it's also ecology. So and that extends to the social systems as well. So that's a bit of a philosophical thought there, but that's where I'm relatively comfortable with the word economy.
Yeah. Look, I think I wouldn't pretend to understand what is in the mind of the minister. That's always a dangerous thing to do when you presume to know, and I don't. But I think what he's doing here is reminding us that actually, if we continue to look at this just as an ecological and environmental issue, it won't be prioritised by government as much as it will be if it's seen as an economic issue. Because if it's an economic issue, then you raise it up to level 1, you know, rather than level 2. And I think, personally, I think that's a really smart piece of positioning, because it means then you need to be looking at it as Minister of Finance. You need to be looking at it through a lens, all of the different economic measures you've got. Now, we can get into the, you know, whether or not that's the right thing to do or not from a tactical or strategic point of view, but I personally think it's a very smart thing to do, because along with everything else that will be impacted by this crisis, our economy certainly is going to be impacted by it. So if it leads to action, I'm all for it. If it leads to more talk, then it's just, you know, it hasn't worked. So I'm hoping it does work. Certainly the moment when I felt most positive at COP last year was when the money people turned up in their helicopters. And they all did turn up in their helicopters. Couldn't hear ourselves talk for a while there. I loved it, because it's like, clearly they can see there's cash in this. The transition is going to make them a whole lot of money. And so you could say, well, that's, you know, that's pretty evil. I say, thank goodness, because we're going to need their cash. And if they don't want to do it for the right reasons, then do it for the wrong reasons. That's fine, as long as the outcome's the same, right? And I feel a wee bit the same with this, which is, if this means that suddenly we've got, you know, captains of industry and CFOs focused on climate, which they are, because they're worried about it from a bottom line perspective, then that's great. That's a great outcome. Otherwise, we're just talking to ourselves, right?
I agree with you, Mike, but the thing we do need to have as well is the vehicle for deploying that capital. And so again, I guess there's money available for anything possibly in this space right now, but actually deploying it and getting it on the ground is part of the challenge, which we are seeing less of at this point.
We're going to vigorously agree on that point, Jeff.
Excellent.
I'll just add one more point too. Among the most empowering forms of speech in the environmental space is when you can have a very sound argument to convince that CFO that this is worth allocating money to. A mate of mine that I went to university with became a CFO of a council, and I introduced him to the concept of ecological infrastructure. He said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, forests, for example, produce a whole lot of goods and services that if they weren't there, they wouldn't enjoy those services." And it helped him understand it as a finance person. It's like, oh, great. He came back to me a few months later saying, "Hey, Sean, it's great. I've managed to justify a whole lot of spending that I could never justify before," because everybody just nodded and said, "Yeah, oh, that's fair enough. You know, we need to invest in infrastructure." So I think, you know, let's ride the economic language and empower ourselves by learning how to have those arguments rather than demanding that CFOs come and sit down and study ecology. Yeah,
well, that's good. Thank you for that. We are coming to a close. I'm going to ask each of our panelists a final question here. So in just, you know, the short and sweet answer, we'll start with Belinda. What are the highlight points of your business's response submission to the draft ERP at this point? Belinda?
We are going to be focusing strongly on evidence-based, science-based, what's really going to reduce our emissions, and that's where we should be focusing our attention. And we will be trying to share the voice of business and what business needs to see to enable, you know, business who emits most of the emissions in New Zealand to reduce ambitiously.
Nice. All right, Jeff, same question.
Much the same as Belinda, clearly evidence-based, and look, we know it works because projects are ongoing and moving forward. But I guess what I wanted to sort of close with is looking at the participant list today, and not everyone can see that, but there's been 300 odd people in the room today. And we got lots of conferences, we talk about this stuff. Look, between Belinda, Mike, Sean, and myself, we do lots of these presentations and talk about the stuff quite often. But I think to a certain degree, all of us are in a bit of an echo chamber, and I think it behoves all of us to take this conversation further afield. Hence why it's really, really important that we all provide a submission to show how meaningful this is, not only for us, but our wider communities as well. So yeah, just to reinforce that. Take it beyond this session.
Great, nice. Sean?
Cap and trade for the ETS redesign. Get a cap on participants, so there's participant specific caps. Strong carbon pricing. Strong synergies between mitigation and adaptation. When the forest sector is involved, send that activity to the regions that need the most in form of erosion control and climate resilience.
Nice. And Mike, what's a highlight from your response?
So we've got four things. We're looking at the adequacy and credibility of the plan, and we're particularly worried about the insufficient margin for error in it. We're looking at the need for a comprehensive plan to meet the budget, and we're currently saying it's not comprehensive. We're looking for greater explanation around the implicit technological dependencies and risks, particularly relating to carbon capture, utilisation and storage. And we're also putting a big piece on transparency and accountability, just making sure that there's no ambiguity in there around terms like electrifying New Zealand and those sort of policies. So the transparency and accountability piece, so that it sheets back to the government of the day and they actually execute the plan.
Wonderful. Now, if you in our audience or watching this recording are thinking about how you're going to craft your submission, the key point all of us want to make sure that you have is please do make that submission. There's a wide range of ways to make that easier. Hopefully the conversation today has helped spur some thinking for you. Each of the organizations our panelists represent will be sharing their responses publicly. They'll be on the various websites by late next week at the latest. So do keep an eye on those, go look at them. Sometimes seeing other people's responses can be the easiest way to help you craft yours, whether you're responding as an individual or as a business or as a collective. But really the key point here is to please make sure that you have your voice heard by the government. They are specifically asking for it in this draft plan. They want our ideas, they want our recommendations, they want to know how we feel about this. So please submit your response to this consultation for the draft emissions reduction plan, the second one. Really appreciate everyone's time and energy this morning. Thank you so much to our panelists and your wonderful insights that you've been able to share. Thank you for your questions. We will get this recording out and we'll do our best to answer as many of the questions that are still open as we can. Please enjoy the wonderful rest of your Thursday. Ka kite.